In the heart of London, where centuries of tradition meet modern danger, one man's split-second decision would either save a life or destroy his own future. When Detective Constable George faced an impossible choice between protocol and humanity, he never imagined that his act of courage would spark a chain of events that would test the very foundations of royal security, challenge the rigid hierarchy of the British establishment, and ultimately redefine what it truly means to serve and protect. This is the true story of how a single moment of bravery nearly cost everything, and why sometimes doing the right thing is the most dangerous choice of all. The morning mist clung to the gates of Buckingham Palace like a protective shroud, masking the careful choreography of security that happened every dawn. Detective Constable James Mitchell had been walking this beat for 7 years, long enough to know that appearances could be deadly deceiving. Behind the tourist-friendly facade of red-coated guards in golden gates lay one of the most sophisticated security operations in the world. James adjusted his radio earpiece as he made his rounds, his trained eyes scanning the growing crowd of early-morning tourists and commuters. At 28, he had already earned a reputation among his colleagues as someone who noticed things others missed. His supervisor, Sergeant Reynolds, often said that James had an almost supernatural ability to spot trouble before it started brewing. The royal family was in residence, which meant security protocols were at their highest level. Every face in the crowd was a potential threat, every abandoned bag a possible bomb, every sudden movement a cause for immediate alert. James had learned to read the subtle signs that separated genuine tourists from those with darker intentions. The way someone held their shoulders, the direction of their gaze, the rhythm of their breathing. All of these told stories that could mean the difference between a peaceful day and a national tragedy. As he rounded the corner near the Victoria Memorial, James noticed a young man standing apart from the usual cluster of selfie-taking tourists. The stranger was well-dressed in a dark coat and carried a leather briefcase, but something about his posture set off alarm bells in James's mind. The man kept checking his watch and glancing nervously toward the palace gates, his free hand fidgeting with something inside his coat pocket. James spoke quietly into his radio, alerting his team to the potential suspicious individual. The response was immediate and professional. Within minutes, he could see other plainclothes officers positioning themselves strategically around the area. This was how the system worked: subtle, efficient, and invisible to the general public. But as James continued to observe the stranger, he realized that something was different about this situation. The man wasn't exhibiting the typical behavioral patterns of someone planning an attack. Instead, he seemed genuinely distressed, almost desperate. His movements weren't calculated or predatory. They were erratic and emotional. The stranger suddenly began walking quickly toward the palace gates, and James felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment when training took over, when split-second decisions could save lives or cost them. James began moving to intercept, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio to call for immediate backup. As he got closer, James could hear the man muttering to himself in what sounded like a foreign language. The briefcase was clutched tightly in his white-knuckled grip, and tears were streaming down his face. This wasn't the cold, calculated approach of a terrorist. This was someone in genuine emotional crisis. The man suddenly stopped and sat down heavily on a bench near the memorial, his shoulders shaking with sobs. James approached carefully, his training telling him to maintain a safe distance while gathering more information. He positioned himself where he could intervene quickly if necessary, while trying to assess the true nature of the threat. From his new vantage point, James could see that the man was younger than he had initially thought, probably in his early 20s. His clothes were expensive but wrinkled, as if he had been wearing them for days. The briefcase appeared to be leather, well-worn but not suspicious in its construction. Most telling of all, the young man's distress seemed absolutely genuine. James made a decision that went against standard protocol. Instead of calling for immediate tactical intervention, he approached the bench and sat down at a respectful distance. His years of experience had taught him that sometimes the greatest threats came not from evil intentions, but from desperate people making terrible decisions in moments of crisis. The young man looked up, startled by James's presence. His eyes were red from crying, and his face showed the kind of exhaustion that comes from days without proper sleep. When he spoke, his accent was distinctly Eastern European, his English heavily accented but clear. "Please," the young man said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak to someone in authority. My sister, she is in terrible danger, and I have nowhere else to turn." James felt a complex mix of emotions. His training screamed at him to call for backup, to follow protocol, to treat this as a potential security threat until proven otherwise. But his instincts, honed by years of community policing before joining the Royal Protection Detail, told him that this was a human being in genuine need of help. The briefcase, James now realized, wasn't a weapon or a bomb. It was clutched like a lifeline, like someone holding on to the only proof they had of something vitally important. The young man's desperation wasn't the calculated manipulation of someone planning an attack. It was the raw, unfiltered emotion of someone who had exhausted every other option. James spoke slowly and clearly, using the kind of calm, reassuring tone he had learned from dealing with hundreds of crisis situations over the years. "What's your name, and what kind of danger is your sister in?" The young man's relief at finding someone willing to listen was palpable. "My name is Viktor Petrov. My sister Elena, she was taken 3 weeks ago. The men who took her, they said they would kill her if I went to the police. But they also said that if I could get a message to someone with real authority, someone who could help, they might be willing to negotiate." James felt the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. This wasn't a simple matter of palace security anymore. This was potentially a kidnapping case with international implications. The young man's presence at the palace gates wasn't an attack. It was a desperate attempt to find someone, anyone, with enough power to help save his sister's life. Victor opened the briefcase with shaking hands, revealing not weapons or explosives, but photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a ransom demand written in multiple languages. James could see pictures of a young woman who bore a strong resemblance to Victor, along with what looked like proof-of-life photos showing her in distress. The moral complexity of the situation hit James like a physical blow. Standard protocol demanded that he treat Victor as a potential threat until a full security assessment could be completed. The Palace Protection Unit didn't deal with kidnapping cases that fell under the jurisdiction of other law enforcement agencies. His job was to protect the royal family, not to involve himself in the personal tragedies of desperate individuals. But looking at Victor's tear-stained face and the desperate evidence spread out in the briefcase, James couldn't bring himself to simply pass this off to another department. The young man had specifically sought out the palace because he believed, perhaps naively, that proximity to power might translate into the ability to help his sister. James realized that he was standing at a crossroads that would define not just Victor's future, but his own as well. He could follow protocol, call for backup, and let the system handle Victor according to standard procedures. It would be safe, correct, and absolutely within the bounds of his authority. Or he could take a risk that might cost him his career, his reputation, and his future, but might also save a young woman's life. The weight of Victor's desperate gaze, the evidence of Elena's danger spread out between them, and the knowledge that time was running out all combined to push James toward a decision that he knew would change everything. In that moment, sitting on a bench in the shadow of Buckingham Palace, Detective Constable James Mitchell chose compassion over protocol and humanity over regulation. What he didn't realize was that this single act of courage would set in motion a chain of events that would test every principle he believed in and challenge. James made his decision with the kind of clarity that only comes in moments of absolute moral certainty. He would help Victor, but he would do it smart. Years of police work had taught him that the difference between a hero and a casualty often came down to preparation and careful planning. Standing up from the bench, James gestured for Victor to follow him to a more secluded area away from the main tourist routes. They walked in silence to a small alcove near the Wellington Arch, where James knew they could talk without being overheard by his colleagues or observed by the numerous security cameras that monitored the palace grounds. James pulled out his personal mobile phone, deliberately avoiding his official radio. What he was about to do fell into a gray area that could easily be interpreted as a violation of protocol, and he wanted to maintain some degree of plausible deniability for as long as possible. "Victor," James said, his voice steady but urgent, "I need you to understand something very important. I'm going to help you, but we need to do this carefully. The people I work for have very strict rules about situations like this, and if we're not smart about how we handle it, we can make things worse for both you and your sister." Victor nodded eagerly, his desperation making him willing to agree to almost anything that might lead to Elena's rescue. James could see the hope flickering in the young man's eyes, and he felt the full weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. James called Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, a colleague from his previous assignment with the Metropolitan Police's Kidnap and Extortion Unit. Sarah had been a mentor to James during his early years on the force, and he knew that if anyone could help navigate the complex jurisdictional issues involved in an international kidnapping case, it would be her. "Sarah, it's James Mitchell. I need a favor, and I needed to stay off the official radar for now." James quickly explained the situation, emphasizing Victor's genuine distress and the apparent credibility of the evidence he had provided. Sarah's response was both professional and concerned. "James, you know I want to help, but you're putting yourself in a very difficult position here. The Palace Protection Unit isn't supposed to get involved in cases like this. If your supervisors find out that you've initiated an unauthorized investigation, it could end your career." James looked at Victor, who was watching the phone conversation with anxious eyes, clearly understanding that his sister's fate was hanging in the balance. I know the risk, Sarah, but this kid's sister is going to die if we don't act fast. The kidnapper specifically told him to find someone with authority, someone who could make things happen. Maybe they think proximity to the palace means access to resources that local police don't have. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing the personal and professional implications of getting involved. Finally, she spoke. All right, James, I'll help, but we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. Meet me at the Starbucks on Piccadilly in 30 minutes. Bring Victor and all the evidence he has. And James, make sure you're not being followed. If this is some kind of elaborate setup, we need to know before we get in too deep. James felt a mixture of relief and anxiety as he ended the call. He had taken the first step down a path that could either save Elena's life or destroy his own career. There was no turning back now. Getting to the Starbucks without being noticed by his colleagues required careful planning. James couldn't simply disappear from his patrol route without filing a report, but he also couldn't explain where he was going or why. He decided to use a personal emergency excuse, telling Sergeant Reynolds that he needed to deal with a family crisis and would be back on duty within 2 hours. The walk through London's busy streets gave James time to gather more details from Victor about the kidnapping. Elena Petrov was a 22-year-old graduate student at Oxford University studying international relations. She had been abducted while walking home from the library late one evening, grabbed by 3 men and forced into a van. Victor had received the first contact from the kidnappers 2 days after Elena's disappearance. The message was simple and terrifying. They wanted £5 million in untraceable cryptocurrency, and they wanted it delivered through channels that could only be accessed by someone with high-level government connections. The kidnappers had made it clear that they weren't interested in dealing with local police or even Interpol. They specifically demanded contact with someone who could access palace-level resources, suggesting that they believed the royal family or its security apparatus had connections to international intelligence networks that could facilitate the kind of complex financial transaction they were demanding. Victor had spent weeks trying to figure out how to meet the kidnappers' demands. He had approached the embassy, local police, and even tried to contact members of parliament, but everyone he spoke to either couldn't help or wouldn't take the case seriously without following official channels that the kidnappers had specifically warned against. James listened to Victor's story with growing unease. The kidnappers' demands suggested a level of sophistication and international connections that went far beyond typical criminal activity. This wasn't a random abduction for quick money. This was a carefully planned operation by people who understood exactly how government and law enforcement agencies operated. When they reached the Starbucks, James immediately spotted Sarah Chen sitting at a corner table, her laptop open and her expression focused and professional. Sarah was in her early 40s, with short black hair and the kind of quiet intensity that came from years of dealing with the worst kinds of human behavior. Sarah looked up as James and Victor approached, her trained eye immediately assessing Victor's demeanor and credibility. Years of interviewing victims and criminals had given her an almost supernatural ability to distinguish between genuine distress and calculated manipulation. "Sit down," Sarah said quietly, gesturing to the chairs across from her. "Victor, I need you to show me everything you have, and I need you to tell me the truth about everything that's happened. Any lies or omissions could get your sister killed and put all of us in serious legal trouble." Victor opened his briefcase again, this time laying out the contents in a more organized manner. There were photographs of Elena, both from before the kidnapping, and proof-of-life images that clearly showed her in distress. There were copies of the ransom demands in English, Russian, and what appeared to be Arabic. Most significantly, there were detailed instructions for accessing a specific cryptocurrency exchange that the kidnappers claimed could only be used by individuals with high-level government authorization. Sarah studied the documents carefully, her expression growing more serious with each piece of evidence. After several minutes of examination, she looked up at James and Victor, with a mixture of concern and professional intrigue. "This is much more complex than a typical kidnapping," Sarah said. "The cryptocurrency exchange they're demanding access to is used primarily by intelligence agencies for funding off-the-books operations. The kidnappers aren't just asking for money. They're asking for access to resources that are typically reserved for national security purposes." James felt his stomach drop as the full implications of Sarah's assessment became clear. Victor's sister hadn't been kidnapped by ordinary criminals. She was being held by people with connections to international intelligence networks, possibly state-sponsored actors or sophisticated criminal organizations with ties to government agencies. "What does this mean for Elena?" Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does it mean she can't be helped?" Sarah's expression softened slightly as she looked at Victor's desperate face. It means that helping her is going to be more dangerous and complicated than we initially thought. But it also means that the kidnappers might actually be willing to negotiate if we can find the right channels to communicate with them. James realized that his decision to help Victor had pulled him into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple act of compassion. They weren't just dealing with kidnappers anymore. They were potentially getting involved in international intelligence operations that could have consequences far beyond Elena's personal safety. But looking at Victor's face, seeing the desperate hope mixed with terror in his eyes, James knew that he couldn't back down now. Elena Petrov was an innocent victim caught up in something she probably didn't understand, and if there was any chance of saving her, they had to take it. The question now was whether they could navigate the complex world of international intelligence and high-level government connections without getting themselves killed in the process. Sarah Chen closed her laptop and leaned forward, her expression grave. The Starbucks around them buzzed with the ordinary sounds of London life. Coffee machines hissing, conversations in multiple languages, the gentle clink of cups and saucers, but at their corner table, the weight of an international crisis was settling like a dark cloud. "I need to make some calls," Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise. "But first, we need to establish some ground rules. What we're about to do is going to put all of us at significant personal and professional risk. Victor, you need to understand that once we start down this path, there's no guarantee of success. And there's a very real possibility that things could get worse for Elena." Victor nodded without hesitation. "She's my only family. Our parents died in a car accident when she was 15. I've been taking care of her ever since. I'll do whatever it takes." James felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with making life or death decisions. His training at the palace had prepared him for protecting others, but nothing had prepared him for navigating the murky waters of international intelligence operations. Sarah pulled out a secure phone that James had never seen before, not her regular police-issued device, but something that looked more sophisticated and definitely more expensive. "I'm going to contact someone I worked with during a previous case involving international kidnappings. He's retired now, but he still has connections within the intelligence community." While Sarah stepped away to make her call, James found himself studying Victor more carefully. The young man's desperation was clearly genuine, but James realized he needed to know more about Elena's background. Graduate students in international relations didn't usually become targets for sophisticated intelligence-related kidnappings unless there was something more to the story. "Victor," James said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything about Elena's studies at Oxford. What exactly was she researching? Who were her professors? Did she have any internships or work experience that might have put her in contact with sensitive information?" Victor's face showed a flicker of something that might have been recognition or concern. Elena was very passionate about her work. She was writing her dissertation on arms trafficking networks in Eastern Europe. She had been doing research interviews with former intelligence officers and military personnel from several countries. James felt a chill of understanding. Elena wasn't just an innocent victim who had been randomly selected by sophisticated kidnappers. Her academic work had likely put her in contact with information or individuals that had made her a target. "Did she ever mention feeling like she was being watched or followed?" James asked. "Any unusual contacts or offers of information that seemed too good to be true?" Victor's expression grew more troubled. "About 6 weeks before she disappeared, Elena told me that she had been approached by someone claiming to be a former Russian military officer who wanted to share information about arms trafficking routes. She was excited because she thought it would be a breakthrough for her dissertation." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place in James's mind. Elena had likely stumbled onto information that someone desperately wanted to keep secret, or she had been deliberately targeted as a way to gain leverage over individuals or organizations connected to her research. Sarah returned to the table, her expression even more serious than before. "I've made contact with my source. The situation is more complicated than we thought, but there might be a way forward. The cryptocurrency exchange the kidnappers are demanding access to is indeed used by intelligence agencies, but it's also used by criminal organizations that have penetrated intelligence networks." She sat down and lowered her voice even further. "My contact believes that Elena was targeted because of her research, but not necessarily by the people who originally had the information she uncovered. This appears to be a case of criminal organizations using kidnapping as a way to gain access to government financial networks." James struggled to process the implications. "So Elena's kidnapping isn't just about money, it's about the kidnappers gaining access to intelligence agency resources?" "Exactly," Sarah confirmed, "which means that paying the ransom could potentially compromise national security operations. But it also means that the government might have more incentive to help us than we initially thought." Victor looked confused and frightened by the direction the conversation was taking. I don't understand. Does this mean Elena is more valuable to them alive, or does it mean they'll kill her if they think she's too much trouble? Sarah's expression softened as she looked at Victor. It means that we need to approach this very carefully. The good news is that my contact is willing to help, but he needs to bring in people from MI6 and possibly the American CIA. The bad news is that once we involve official intelligence agencies, none of us will have any control over how the situation develops. James realized they had reached another crucial decision point. Involving intelligence agencies might save Elena's life, but it would also certainly end his career and potentially put all of them at risk from both the kidnappers and their own governments. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sergeant Reynolds. "Where are you? Need you back on duty immediately. Royal visit moved up to this afternoon." The message hit James like a physical blow. He had been so focused on Elena's crisis that he had forgotten his primary responsibility. The royal family was preparing for an unexpected public appearance, which meant that security protocols would be at their highest level. His absence would be noted, investigated, and potentially traced back to his unauthorized involvement in Victor's case. "I have to go," James said, showing the message to Sarah. "My supervisors are looking for me, and if I don't show up immediately, they're going to start asking questions that could expose everything we're trying to do." Sarah nodded grimly. "Go. I'll continue working with Victor and my contact. But James, you need to understand that once you walk away from here, you might not be able to help anymore. If the intelligence agencies take over, they'll want to keep their operations completely separate from anyone connected to palace security." James looked at Victor, seeing the fear and desperation in the young man's eyes.
"What about the kidnapper's deadline? How much time do we have?" Victor checked his phone, his hands shaking slightly.
"They said they would contact me at midnight tonight for my final answer. If I can't provide access to the cryptocurrency exchange by tomorrow morning, they said they would." He couldn't finish the sentence. James made a decision that he knew would haunt him regardless of the outcome. "Victor, give me your phone number. If I can find a way to help from my end, any connections within the palace security apparatus that might be useful, I'll contact you. Sarah, keep me informed if you can, but prioritize Elena's safety over everything else." As James prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed his arm. "James, I want you to know that what you're doing is incredibly brave. You're risking everything to help a complete stranger, and that takes a level of moral courage that's rare in any profession." Walking back toward Buckingham Palace, James felt the weight of multiple responsibilities crushing down on him. He had a duty to protect the royal family, a commitment to help Victor save his sister, and an obligation to preserve his own career and future. These responsibilities were now in direct conflict with each other, and any choice he made would require sacrificing something important. The afternoon sun was beginning to break through London's perpetual cloud cover as James approached the palace gates. He could see his colleagues taking their positions for the unexpected royal appearance, their movements precise and professional. This was the world he belonged to. Disciplined, hierarchical, focused on clear objectives and established protocols. But as he rejoined his team and fell back into the familiar rhythms of his official duties, James couldn't stop thinking about Elena Petrov. Locked away somewhere by people who viewed her life as nothing more than a bargaining chip in a much larger and more dangerous game. His radio crackled with routine communications. His colleagues moved through their assigned positions, and the tourists continued their endless stream of photographs and excited chatter. On the surface, everything appeared normal, professional, and under control. But James knew that beneath this veneer of normalcy, a young woman's life hung in the balance, and the choices made in the next few hours would determine whether his act of compassion would save a life or cost him everything he had worked to build. The afternoon royal appearance went off without incident, but James barely managed to focus on his duties. Every routine security check, every scan of the crowd, every radio communication felt like it was happening in slow motion while his mind raced through the implications of Elena's kidnapping. As the royal motorcade disappeared through the palace gates and the crowds began to disperse, James realized that he had been operating on autopilot for the past 3 hours. Sergeant Reynolds approached him with a concerned expression. "Mitchell, you seem distracted today. Is everything all right with your family emergency?" James felt his heart rate spike, but his training kicked in and he maintained his composure. "Yes, sir. Just some personal matters that needed attention. Everything's resolved now." Reynolds studied James's face with the kind of scrutiny that came from years of evaluating the mental state of officers under pressure. "Good. Because I've got some news that's going to require everyone to be at the top of their game. We've received intelligence about potential security threats related to international organized crime. Nothing specific to the palace, but Scotland Yard wants us to be extra vigilant for the next few days." The irony of the situation hit James like a physical blow. The very case he was involved in might be connected to the general security alert that was now affecting his official duties. He wondered if Sarah's contact had already begun sharing information with other agencies, creating ripples that were now reaching back to him through official channels. James's phone vibrated with a text message from Sarah. Need to meet. Situation has developed. Same place, 8 p.m. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of routine duties and mounting anxiety. When James finally finished his official responsibilities and changed out of his uniform, he felt like he was stepping from one world into another, from the structured, regulated environment of palace security into the murky territory of international intelligence operations. The evening air was crisp as James walked through London's busy streets toward the meeting point. The city around him buzzed with normal life, people heading home from work, couples meeting for dinner, tourists exploring the historic landmarks. None of them had any idea that somewhere in this vast metropolis, a young woman was being held captive by people who operated in the shadows between governments and criminal organizations. Sarah was already waiting when James arrived, but she wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm, observant demeanor that James immediately recognized as belonging to someone with extensive intelligence training. "James, this is David Hartwell," Sarah said as James approached their table. "He's the contact I told you about. Former MI6, now working as a private security consultant." David extended his hand with a firm grip and a direct gaze. "Detective Constable Mitchell, Sarah has told me about your willingness to help Viktor Petrov. I want you to know that what you're doing is admirable, but you need to understand the full scope of what you've gotten yourself involved in." James sat down, noting that David had chosen a table with clear sightlines to all entrances and exits, old habits from a career in intelligence work. "I understand that it's more complex than I initially thought, but I also understand that Elena Petrov is going to die if someone doesn't help her." David nodded approvingly. "Good. That kind of moral clarity is going to be important for what comes next. I've spent the afternoon making inquiries through my former colleagues, and I've learned several things that change the dynamics of this situation significantly." He pulled out a tablet and showed James a photograph of Elena Petrov, but it wasn't one of the pictures Viktor had shown them earlier. This was clearly a surveillance photo, taken without Elena's knowledge as she walked across what appeared to be a university campus. "Elena Petrov has been under loose surveillance by British intelligence for the past 4 months, David continued. Not because she was considered a threat, but because her research had led her to information that several governments preferred to keep classified. James felt a chill of understanding. So, the British government knew she might be in danger? They knew her research was potentially sensitive, but they didn't anticipate that criminal organizations would target her as a way to gain access to intelligence networks, David explained. Elena had uncovered connections between arms trafficking operations and certain government officials in Eastern Europe. That information was valuable enough that someone was willing to kidnap her to use as leverage. Sarah leaned forward, her expression tense. David's contacts have confirmed that the cryptocurrency exchange the kidnappers are demanding access to has been compromised. Criminal organizations have been using kidnappings and extortion to force intelligence agencies to provide access to their financial networks. The scope of the criminal conspiracy was becoming clear to James, and it was far larger than he had imagined. "So Elena isn't the first victim of this kind of operation?" "No," David confirmed. "There have been at least 6 similar cases in the past 2 years, involving researchers, journalists, and even low-level government employees across Europe and North America. The kidnappers target people who have access to sensitive information, then use them to extort access to government resources." James realized that his decision to help Viktor had pulled him into the middle of an ongoing intelligence war between government agencies and sophisticated criminal networks. What does this mean for Elena's chances of survival? David's expression was grim, but not hopeless. "It means that the British government has a strong interest in resolving this case successfully. They can't allow criminal organizations to continue using kidnapping as a way to penetrate intelligence networks. But it also means that Elena's value to the kidnappers goes beyond simple ransom money." Sarah spoke up. "David's contacts are willing to help, but they need something from you, James. They need someone with access to palace security protocols who can help them understand how deeply these criminal networks may have penetrated British government systems." James felt the full weight of the ethical dilemma settling on his shoulders. The intelligence agencies were asking him to potentially compromise his position within palace security in order to help save Elena's life and protect national security interests. "What specifically are they asking me to do?" David leaned closer, lowering his voice even though their conversation was already barely audible above the ambient noise of the cafe. They need you to run some discrete checks on recent security assessments and personnel files. There's a possibility that someone within the palace security apparatus has been compromised by the same criminal network that kidnapped Elena. The implications hit James like a physical blow. If there was a security breach within his own organization, it could explain how the kidnappers had known to target Elena specifically, and how they had obtained such detailed information about intelligence agency financial networks. If I do this, and if my supervisors discover what I'm doing, it won't just end my career, James said. It could be interpreted as treason. That's true, David acknowledged. But if you don't do it, Elena Petrov will likely be killed, and the criminal network will continue to use kidnapping as a way to compromise government security systems. The choice is entirely yours, but I want you to understand that time is running out. James looked at his watch. It was nearly 9 p.m., which meant they had less than 3 hours before the kidnappers' midnight deadline. Victor was somewhere in London, waiting for news that could determine whether his sister lived or died. James thought about Elena Petrov, a young graduate student whose only crime had been pursuing academic research that had accidentally uncovered dangerous truths. He thought about Victor's desperate face and the proof-of-life photographs that showed Elena's terror and desperation. But he also thought about his colleagues, the royal family he had sworn to protect, and the career he had spent years building. His decision would affect not just Elena's life, but the security of the British government and his own future. If I agree to help, James said slowly, what guarantees do I have that Elena will actually be rescued? And what protection will I have if this operation goes wrong? David's expression was honest and direct. I can't give you any guarantees, James. Intelligence operations always involve risk, and sometimes they fail despite everyone's best efforts. But I can tell you that if we don't act tonight, Elena Petrov will definitely die, and the criminal network will become even bolder in their future operations. James realized that he was facing the kind of moral test that defined a person's character. He could walk away, return to his normal duties, and let other people deal with the complex political and intelligence implications of Elena's kidnapping. It would be safe, rational, and completely within his rights. Or he could risk everything to save the life of someone he had never met, someone whose only connection to him was through Victor's desperate plea for help outside the palace gates that morning. The weight of the decision seemed to press down on him from all sides. But as James looked at Sarah and David's faces, he realized that his choice had already been made the moment he decided to help Victor instead of following standard security protocol. James made his decision with the same clarity that had driven him to help Victor that morning. I'll do it, but I want to be involved in the rescue operation. If I'm risking everything to help save Elena, I want to be there to make sure it works. David nodded with what might have been respect. I was hoping you would say that. We're going to need someone with your training and security clearance for what comes next. The next 2 hours moved with the intensity and precision of a military operation. David's intelligence contacts had been tracking the kidnappers through financial and communication networks, and they had narrowed down Elena's location to an abandoned warehouse complex in East London. James used his palace security access to run discreet background checks on recent personnel files, looking for any indicators of possible compromise or suspicious activity. What he found confirmed David's worst suspicions. 3 security contractors who had been given temporary access to palace systems over the past 6 months had financial connections to shell companies linked to Eastern European criminal networks. The security breach wasn't within the core palace protection unit, but it was close enough to explain how the criminal organization had obtained detailed information about government intelligence networks and protocols. James's discovery provided the missing piece of evidence that David's colleagues needed to authorize immediate action. By 11:30 p.m., James found himself in the back of an unmarked van with Sarah, David, and 4 other individuals who had clearly been selected for their expertise in high-risk operations. The vehicle was equipped with communication gear that looked more sophisticated than anything James had seen in his police training. The plan is simple, David explained as they drove through London's dimly lit streets. The kidnappers are expecting Victor to make contact at midnight with information about accessing the cryptocurrency exchange. Instead, we're going to give them Victor, but with backup they won't see coming. Victor was in a second vehicle, wearing a wire and carrying a briefcase that appeared to contain the access codes the kidnappers had demanded. In reality, the briefcase contained tracking devices and a small explosive charge that could be remotely detonated if necessary. James felt his training taking over as they approached the warehouse district. His years of experience in high-stress security situations had prepared him for the physical and mental demands of what they were about to attempt, but nothing had prepared him for the emotional weight of knowing that Elena's life depended on their success. The warehouse complex was a sprawling area of abandoned buildings and empty lots that provided perfect cover for illegal activities. David's team had been conducting surveillance for the past 2 hours, identifying guard positions and escape routes that the kidnappers had established. 3 guards on the perimeter, 2 inside the main building with Elena, David reported through his earpiece. They're well armed and clearly experienced, but they're not expecting us to have found them this quickly. James positioned himself with a clear line of sight to the building's main entrance, his service weapon ready, but hoping he wouldn't need to use it. The goal was to rescue Elena and capture the kidnappers alive, preserving the intelligence value they represented while minimizing the risk of violence. At exactly midnight, Victor walked toward the warehouse entrance, his steps measured and deliberate despite what James knew must be overwhelming fear. The young man had volunteered to act as bait, understanding that his sister's rescue depended on the kidnappers believing they were still in control of the situation. The exchange began exactly as the kidnappers had planned. Victor was met by 2 armed men who escorted him inside the building while maintaining radio contact with their associates. David's team listened to the conversations through sophisticated electronic surveillance, tracking the kidnappers' positions and communications in real time. Elena is alive and appears to be unharmed, David whispered through the earpiece. She's in a room on the 2nd floor, guarded by 1 man with an automatic weapon. Victor is being taken to meet with the operation leader in the main warehouse space. James felt his heart rate spike as he realized that the moment of action was approaching. Everything they had planned, all the risks they had taken, would be decided in the next few minutes. Go, David's voice came through the earpiece with calm authority. James moved with his assigned team toward the warehouse's rear entrance, using the urban combat techniques he had learned during his police training. The building was dark except for a few strategic lights, and the kidnappers had chosen their position well. It provided multiple escape routes while offering good defensive positions, but David's team had advantages the kidnappers didn't expect. Intelligence surveillance had provided detailed floor plans of the building, and electronic monitoring had revealed the exact positions of all the guards and captives. James reached Elena's location first, moving silently up a rusted metal staircase to the 2nd floor. Through a partially open door, he could see a young woman tied to a chair, her face showing the exhaustion and terror of 3 weeks in captivity. The guard was positioned near a window, watching the main approach to the building, but not expecting an attack from the rear. Using techniques learned from years of high-risk security work, James neutralized the guard quickly and quietly, ensuring that Elena's safety was secured before the main confrontation began downstairs. Elena Petrov looked up at James with a mixture of hope and disbelief as he cut through the ropes that bound her. "Are you real?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from weeks of fear and limited water. "I'm real, and your brother sent me," James said gently as he helped her to her feet. "We're going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay quiet and do exactly what I tell you." The sound of gunfire from downstairs indicated that the main assault had begun. David's team was moving to capture the kidnappers and rescue Victor, while James focused on getting Elena to safety through the building's rear exit. As they moved carefully down the metal staircase, James could hear radio communications indicating that the operation was proceeding according to plan. The kidnappers had been caught off guard by the speed and precision of the rescue, and their defensive positions were being systematically eliminated. "Package secured," James reported through his earpiece as he and Elena reached the designated extraction point. "Elena Petrov is safe and mobile." David's voice came back with obvious relief. "Excellent work, James. Victor is secure, and we have 3 suspects in custody. The 4th fled, but left behind significant intelligence material." As they waited for the extraction vehicle, Elena grabbed James's arm with surprising strength. "Thank you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Victor told me that someone from the palace was helping. I didn't believe it was possible." James realized that Elena didn't know the full story of how her rescue had been accomplished, or what it had cost the people who had made it possible. She didn't know that her brother had risked everything to find help, or that James had potentially sacrificed his career to save her life. The ride back into central London was quiet, with Elena slowly beginning to process her freedom after weeks of captivity. Victor sat beside her, holding her hand and speaking softly, in what James assumed was Russian, reassuring her that the nightmare was finally over. David spent the journey debriefing with his intelligence contacts, discussing the larger implications of what they had discovered about the criminal network's penetration of government security systems. The operation had been successful, but it had also revealed security vulnerabilities that would require months of investigation and reform. As they approached the safe house where Elena and Victor would be taken for debriefing and protection, James realized that his own ordeal was just beginning. He had helped save a life and exposed a significant security threat, but he had also violated numerous regulations and procedures that governed his position within palace security. "What happens to me now?" James asked David as they prepared to part ways. David's expression was thoughtful and honest. That depends on several factors. Your actions tonight helped prevent a major intelligence breach and saved an innocent life. But you also violated your oath of office and potentially compromised palace security protocols. The people who make those decisions are above my level, but I'll make sure they understand exactly what you accomplished and why you did it. James nodded, understanding that his future was now out of his hands. He had made his choice based on moral principle rather than career considerations, and he would have to accept whatever consequences followed. 3 days later, James received a call requesting his presence at a meeting with senior officials from both Palace Security and British intelligence services. He dressed in his best suit, knowing that this would likely be the conversation that determined the rest of his professional life. The meeting was held in a nondescript government building in Westminster, with officials whose names and faces James recognized from security briefings, but had never expected to meet personally. They questioned him extensively about his decisions, his motivations, and his assessment of the security implications of what he had discovered. After 2 hours of intense discussion, the senior official from Palace Security looked directly at James. "Detective Constable Mitchell, your actions violated numerous protocols and procedures. Under normal circumstances, this would result in immediate dismissal and possible criminal charges." James felt his stomach drop, but he maintained his composure. "I understand, sir. However," the official continued, "your actions also resulted in the rescue of an innocent victim and the exposure of a significant security breach that could have had serious national security implications. After extensive consultation with our colleagues in the intelligence services, we have decided to offer you a choice." James waited, hardly daring to hope for anything positive. "You can return to your current position with a formal reprimand and additional oversight, or you can accept a transfer to a joint task force that deals with cases involving intersection between criminal activity and intelligence operations. The work would be more dangerous but also more significant in scope." James realized that his act of compassion had not only saved Elena's life, but it also opened a door to a career he had never imagined possible. His willingness to risk everything for a stranger had demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that intelligence work required. 6 months later, James stood in a very different kind of uniform, outside a very different kind of government building, preparing for another day of work that involved protecting innocent people from sophisticated criminal organizations. Elena Petrov had returned to Oxford to complete her dissertation, now under the protection of security services who understood the value of her research. Victor had decided to remain in London, working with David Hartwell's consulting firm and helping to identify other potential targets of the criminal network that had kidnapped his sister. The two brothers had built a new life based on the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is ask for help from the right person at the right time. James often thought about that morning outside Buckingham Palace when Victor had approached him with desperate eyes and a briefcase full of evidence. The decision to help had seemed simple at the time, a choice between compassion and protocol, between humanity and regulation. But James now understood that the choice had been much more complex than that. It had been a test of his willingness to risk personal security for moral principle, to value human life over career advancement, and to trust that doing the right thing would ultimately lead to the right outcome. Standing outside the intelligence building where he now worked, watching the ordinary people of London go about their daily lives, James felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that somewhere among those crowds, Elena and Victor Petrov were building new lives made possible by his decision to care about strangers. The morning mist clung to the London streets just as it had that day at the palace. But James no longer saw it as something that concealed potential threats. Instead, he saw it as a reminder that sometimes the most important decisions are made in moments of uncertainty, when the right choice isn't clear but the moral choice is unmistakable.